and thank you, Susan, for having me here, and for everybody who's here, who I've learned so much from. I started writing about this subject without really knowing anything, and it almost seems miraculously, I fell in with a very good group of people. And what you've all got going for yourselves is tremendous research and facts and motivation. And unfortunately, the media doesn't always use those facts. So let's see. How do I use this thing?
Just click something.
Do I have to turn it on, John?
Yeah, it should still be on, but there's a little switch.
Okay. I don't know which one. There we go. Okay, so the screen seems to be cutting off some of my text. Oh, well, anyway, it says, is disinformation inevitable and, God, I can't even remember what I said there. It probably says unsolvable. And it certainly seems as though disinformation is very pervasive. And, if you know these two statements by Mark Twain, if you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you read the newspaper, you're misinformed. And then, of course, never pick a fight with people who buy ink by the barrel. I was actually told, I mentioned to somebody rather prominent in a large animal welfare organization why he did not push back on some of the misinformation that the media shares so freely. And he made that quote to me, and I thought, I don't care if you got ink by the barrel. I'm pushing back. And an odd bit of disclosure here. Some of you may know that I published an article yesterday on wild horses. And in fact, it got the largest audience in a single day of any article I've ever written. I think it's now up to... It's up to, I think, 22,000 views, and I initially proposed that story on wild horses, which really picks up on the Clive and Bundy story, and it looks at the consequences to the federal grazing program for taxpayers and wild horses, which is something, of course, that anybody who's a wild horse person knows never gets talked about. And so I proposed that as an op-ed piece for the New York Times. They turned it down. I posted it to the Washington Post. They turned it down. So I published it on Forbes. And I'm sorry to say that's going to be my last post on Forbes because they told me last evening that they want to sever the relationship. So animal journalism is really not their thing. And I have basically, for 3 years, had a very great platform there to introduce animal industries as something not just as a human interest story, but as a political story, as an economic story, as a food safety story, as an environmental story, and all of those things are relative to Forbes, but it's not really their strong, they're more finance and et cetera. So anyway, I'm going to be moving on, but I do think it's worth pushing back on anybody who's got ink by the barrel. I think just because an organization is big, if they're wrong, and you have to let them know when they're wrong. One of the reasons that I took this on is it's partially because of the subject matter, but it's also because I strongly believe that the public has a right to be informed. And as somebody who writes for the media, that is my responsibility, is to rightly inform the public. And of course, as you know, for your issue, it's very important that the public is rightly informed. So in this particular slide, 16 years ago, there was just an example of how disinformation damages the public. In 1998, there was a small, now discredited survey published in The Lancet. It caused a media frenzy in which the childhood vaccine, MMR, was linked to autism and bowel conditions. The study was retracted for being false. Still, there was a drop in vaccinations causing a number of deaths. It has taken 16 years for that damage to be undone. So disinformation is the kind of thing that you can't let lie. It's the kind of thing you have to jump on right away. And all of you here are capable of doing that. In fact, all of you need to be doing that. Is there a way to fix? Yeah.
It's the same way on the computer.
That's what you have on your
It's cut off, really? Okay. Never mind. Oh, never mind. It's just a formatting thing. So obviously there's been disinformation on a lot of the topics that are important to people here. Let's see, can I do all this at the same time? So you've got, your carriage horse articles, wild horses, and slaughter. And as you can see, all these topics have been covered, going back. Here is I think this is an op-ed piece by Holly. Didn't you write an? I think this might have your name on it.
What's it? I can't quite see the print.
Well, it's from the New York Times. It's an opinion piece from 1989. It says, treatment of carriage horses is a blight on New York's image.
That was me.
Yay. But the media loves these stories. So, here we've got 1989, 1997, 2007. This is the original article from the Associated Press talking about how there are all these abandoned horses, which John Holland and a group of people debunked, right? And but anyway, it continues. Here's stories 2012 last week for the carriage horse issue. Is getting a lot of media attention. On the wild horse issue, all these articles. This is big topic for the media. They get a lot of mileage out of it. And same thing on the horse slaughter issue. So media loves animal stories, and they love horse stories. But there's one thing that's not happening, and that's...
Uh-oh. Other microphone?
Move that way, just one step that way. Okay.
I'm going to move around the front. So there's one thing, though, that's happening, and that there's a disconnect because the media doesn't want what you want. You guys have got facts. You want to get the story right? You care about facts and getting the public to understand the complex political environment story because ultimately you want changes in legislation. And the media wants to get the story out. They want sensational human interest stories that bring in a big audience and cost nothing to produce. They want graphic, simple, and fast. They will spend the least possible resources to make this happen, which means oftentimes, inexperienced reporters and sound bites from recognized sources, so they do not have to spend money on research or fact-checking. The media does not fact-check, but I don't think that's probably a surprise to anyone. And what drives disinformation are media values. So everyone loves animal stories, so anybody can write them, which is obviously a problem because in order to write a really good story about animals and animal topics, you have to have some scientific knowledge. You have to, it's not just a matter of moving from writing about vacations to writing about a complex issue like horse slaughter. So there's subject knowledge is not required. Scientific, political, environmental, or economic reporting skills are not required. Animal advocates are mistrusted as sources unless from national welfare groups, which is a real setback. Industry spokespeople are viewed as trustworthy. Fact-checking, corrections, and retractions are discretionary, and they're constrained by no money and tight deadlines. Other media values that drive disinformation, and I think this is really explained so well why you get the kind of misinformed, sensational stories full of errors that you do. The media has a great appetite for a big scare story. They have a desire to overstate a claim based on an expert and a small study. The reluctance to put one alarming piece of research into a wider, more revealing context. They use the this template of journalistic balance, having two experts debate each other. And this suggests a significant divide in scientific opinion when none actually exists. And then, of course, there's the love of a maverick. And these 5 points were, I found them on this website for a place called the Science and Media Center. And this is an entire organization that was formed to combat phony or false or unfactual science reporting. And it arose out of that case with the vaccine story. So the Science and Media Center basically identified these values as continuing to drive disinformation. And so here's how it plays out with regard to, for example, the slaughter issue. The appetite for a great scare story, the horse meat scandal. The desire to overstate a claim based on an expert, our friend from Roswell, New Mexico. The overstated claim is the The abused and neglected horses, the small study is the GAO report. Oh boy, my type and my fonts looked a lot better on my computer, sorry. The reluctance to put one alarming piece of research into a wider, more revealing context. John talked about that earlier, that the wider, more revealing context was several years' worth of data, not just to a beginning point and an end point. Then there's this whole thing about journalistic balance, suggesting a significant divide in scientific opinion. You know, I think most of the time when we read these stories that are incorrect, what's infuriating about them is it seems as though they've only identified 2 people in the entire United States who know this issue, and they're almost always Wayne Pacelli and somebody. That's Wayne, that's Rick De Los Santos. And then, of course, there's the love of the maverick. Sue Wallace got a ton of press because she was so outspoken. Who doesn't love a big, what was she, like 6 feet tall? Like a huge, tall woman in a cowboy hat with the horse meat cookbook. What's not to love? You know, here's the same deal on the wild horse issue. Appetite for a great scare story, running Mustangs with a helicopter. You know, the overstated claim, which was these drought conditions. The drought report, Joan Guilfoyle is our expert, and the small study was all this, you know, this drought, you know, conditions in the West, which of course were perfectly real. The reluctance to put that one alarming piece of research into a wider, more revealing context. Few horses, lots of cows, lots of cattle. You know, that was so infuriating, I think, to everybody. Again, this whole thing of journalistic balance. You know, large welfare groups who oftentimes did not have the information that you guys have because you're closer to the issue. And of course, the love of the maverick, our friend, Mr. Bundy. So, I think a lot of people noticed early on that the Associated Press's coverage had many, many errors in them. But they had all these same elements: scare story, overstated claim, expert, small study, missing context, journalistic balance, and a maverick. And so this is just, I'm just going to read this, because these statements appeared in 18 different articles. Essentially, the reporter relied on the GAO report and false statements from sources. And she cut and pasted them 18 times into 18 different articles. I wouldn't do that, but anyway. A return to domestic horse slaughter has divided horse rescue and animal welfare groups, ranchers, politicians, and Indian tribes about what is the most humane way to deal with the country's horse overpopulation, and what rescue groups have said are a rising number of neglected and starving horses as the West deals with persistent drought. Proponents of a return to domestic horse slaughter point to a 2011 report from the Federal Government Accountability Office that shows horse abuse and abandonment have been increasing since slaughter was banned in 2006. They say it is better to slaughter the animals in humane, federally regulated facilities than have them abandoned to starve across the drought-stricken West or shipped to inhumane facilities in Mexico. BS. So the overstated claim that they were dealing with was that horse abuse and abandonment have been increasing since slaughter was banned in 2006, and thank God John noticed in the GAO report that the dates did not match up with the data. So essentially, this was a persuasive but wrong statement, but of course they put it out there 18 times. These are all the articles that statement appeared in. All of these, I'm sorry that got a little messed up, but same deal, 18 articles. Those statements, those false statements were recycled 18 times. And the error was that the dates and the data didn't correlate. And of course, John's explained that already, so I won't go through it again. But I did write a story based on John's finding that the GAO report was falsified, and wrote about that in Forbes. And so this described why the dates that Jerry Clousing had used and the data just did not work. So I think it's kind of well, anyway, I think it's kind of interesting to look at what the Associated Press says about itself to understand why this story spread so far and wide and why it had such a big political impact. As the Associated Press says, they're one of the largest, most trusted sources of news gathering in the entire world. Seen by half the world's population on any given day. That's pretty good. Commitment to independent, comprehensive journalism, 24-hour continuously updated online multimedia news service, one of the largest radio networks in the US. Content also available on AP Mobile, the company's award-winning news app that has been downloaded 9 million times since its launch in 2008. And it says, an AP story that has moved on the national wire will be available to all 1,400 of the AP's US daily newspaper members. That's a lot. Their errors spread virally via the mainstream news media from 2012 to 2014. And I just went and I actually had some assistance putting together a spreadsheet of all the news organizations that picked up these stories. But you can see, I mean, it's every major network, every major newspaper, national newspaper, you know, award-winning newspapers, small local newspapers, some trade newspapers, Bloomberg, Reuters, Christian Science Monitor, Salon, thought leadership publications. Everybody picked this stuff up. And the AP stories were also repurposed. This is kind of interesting, I think. They were repurposed by Reuters under somebody else's name. So here's what appeared on the AP site, and here's what appeared on NBC News site. It had the AP Jerry Klausing stamp on it, but then it had a Reuters reporter's title on it, and same story, same cut and paste language. Valley Meat would be the first meat plant to be allowed to slaughter horses since Congress banned it in 2006. Congress effectively banned horse slaughter in 2006 by saying the USDA could not spend any money to inspect horse plants. Without USDA inspection, meat plants cannot operate. So they took her language and rewrote it, but of course it was wrong. And you know, one of the things that that the AP didn't understand was that even though the defunding, which was voted on in 2005 to take place in 2006, they thought that closed the plants, but it didn't. It was state laws in 2007 in Texas and Illinois which shut them down, but they didn't know that. So it was, I think, kind of a very confusing, it's a confusing subject, and they didn't understand what they were writing about, so they got it wrong. Anyway, this is the same AP, Reuters reporter, and you know, he's their ag reporter. Farm and food reporter. And so, of course, you know, this is what he came out with. He just took the wrong information from the Associated Press and ran with it. So what was the impact of all this? It impacted politics and legislation. Here you see Sky McNeil, who had introduced one of the bills in Oklahoma to overturn the ban on horse slaughter, a 50-year ban. And Protect the Harvest, of course, was involved. And so look at what she says. I see the problem of the abused, abandoned, starved horses, and I see what it does when our sheriff has to pick up those horses and quarantine for 30 and 60 days. It's taxpayer dollars, she said. And I see when people have nowhere to go with their horses, but just to turn them out or cut fences and put them into somebody else's pastures. I understand this issue maybe more than anybody else. A much-needed solution to alleviate horse abandonment and neglect. And anybody who listened in on the hearings when those bills were being overturned heard their lawmakers repeat those same statements over and over and over again. So, I'm going to see if any of you know who said this. In Oklahoma, as in other states, abuse is tragically common among horses that are reaching the end of their natural lives. Many are abandoned or left to starve to death. Others are shipped out of the country, many to Mexico, where they're processed in potentially inhumane conditions that are not regulated by the U.S. government. Unfortunately, the 2006 federal ban on horse processing plants has made this situation worse. After the implementation of that ban, the Government Accountability Office, blah, 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 blah. Those of us who care about the well-being of horses, and we all should, cannot be satisfied with a status quo that encourages abuse and neglect, or that rewards the potentially inhumane slaughter of animals in foreign countries. So, anybody want to take a guess? Who said that?
Was it the governor?
The governor. And how do you like this? For that reason, I have today signed HB 1999. She used that misinformation to support the overturning of this bill. That's really serious. That is a serious, way that disinformation harms the public. Well, getting back to the Associated Press, they have on their website, it's called their News Values and Principles. And those news values and principles are pretty sacred. And here's what they say. We abhor inaccuracies, carelessness, bias, or distortions. When we're wrong, we must say so as soon as possible. When we make a correction in the current cycle, we point out the error and fix it in the editor's note. Did any of you ever see an editor's note pointing out any errors? I don't think so. A correction must always be labeled a correction in the editor's note. We do not use euphemisms such as recasts, fixes, clarifies, or changes when correcting a factual error. A corrective corrects a mistake from a previous cycle. The AP asks papers or broadcasters that use the erroneous information to use the corrective too. I think those are some pretty good values, but they did not practice them. So, how quickly did they correct ASAP? Well, here's my little timeline. I reached out 62 emails, phone calls, and letters to 34 AP edit staff. That's a lot. That is not responding ASAP to errors. Jerry Clousing, I reached out to 5 times in June and August. You can see it's a lot. 5 times to her boss, 6 times to the AP corrections line, which lost my first email, didn't respond to the second, and when I reached them on the phone, they hung up on me. Some of you may know what she called me, but it's not repeatable here. They tried to discredit me. They did not want to look at the materials that I provided. They did not understand them. And it's not like I expect, or any of you expect, anybody to quickly pick up the complexities. Take some explanation. I offered to give them one. They did not seem to be interested. Tracy Carl, she's the Western editor of 13 states, newsrooms in 13 states. I had 16 conversations with her. The CEO, Gary Pruitt, in January 6th, they received from me, Gary Pruitt and 6 executives and then the members of their editorial board, 24 people in all, a detailed letter signed by me, Susan, Paula, John, Anne Marini. I can't remember everybody at this point, but all the people that one would assume you would heed in terms of their expertise, but they ignored it. This letter talked about the error they made, and the thing about corrections is, I figured we got something pretty simple on them. They got a date wrong. So I went after them to prove that their date was wrong. Well, if the date was wrong, then the correlation didn't work. So I figured, it's pretty easy to prove a date's wrong. Who's going to argue against a wrong date? Guess. So these were the errors that I detailed for them. The first letter that I sent out to them in May a year ago, and I did an analysis of bias in their journalism, and the way that I did that is I cut and pasted the text from 7 articles into a document, and then I just went through and color-coded it. And if there was an argument pro-slaughter, I'd make it one color, and if there was a anti-slaughter, I'd make it another color. And 69.4% of their story was a pro-slaughter story. So when I first wrote to them, I said, your reporters got some facts wrong, but more than that, your reporting is very biased. And they said, no, I don't think so. And so I sent them this, showing how how many experts they had speaking for one side versus another, how much time did they give them, what kind of arguments were they allowed to make. And it clearly showed that their reporting was biased, but of course they didn't think so. This is the copy of the letter that I sent to Gary Pruitt that was signed. Oh, Ginger also signed it. You know, experts that are well known to know their facts, and they ignored them. So then I did have a conversation with Tracy Carl. I got bounced around a lot. I got passed from their standards. And by the way, when I sent that letter to 24 people at the Associated Press, none of them responded. That's pretty major. I got a letter from their standards editor who repeated the errors that they'd made in their stories and said, see, we got this right. And I was like, no. But I spoke to Tracy Carl, and so I asked her, you know, you didn't check your facts. Why didn't you check your facts? And this is what she said: not our job. The world's, or one of the world's largest news gathering organizations said it's not our job to fact check our sources. How about that? Does that bother anybody here? She said the only duty they had was to share the story. So share Rick De Los Santos' story. And that their job is not to fact check their sources for accuracy, only to tell their story. So you could have two people who know nothing about an issue, but all you have to do is have them talk to each other, and that's the story that you will get. She said, I said to her, they got dates and data wrong. That's a problem. She said, data's not necessarily factual. And facts themselves aren't anything more than opinions. So, a false date producing an erroneous correlation with unrelated data is, in the AP's eyes, an opinion expressed by a source. If a source believes a falsehood and even uses false data to promote that falsehood, as Mr. De Los Santos, Blair Dunn, and various other supporters have done, the AP's only duty is to quote them and then present another source holding an opposite view. These kinds of stories are labeled as news, even though they are opinions. She said then the AP leaves it up to readers to then make up their own minds. Well, how do readers make up their minds when 69% of the story that's being told to them is wrong and they don't know it? Serious, serious issue. This was very instructive to me because I thought, no, she's not telling me that it's not their job to fact check, right? She's not saying that. But that's what she was saying. And you know, by the way, I wrote back to her and I said, really, if dates and data are opinions? And then I said, well, if they're opinions, why weren't these labeled as opinion pieces? You labeled them as news, and she didn't respond. So, given the fact that one of their duties is to contact all the media, get the story wrong, how many correctives do you think that would add up to? Well, a lot. So this is just an email that I exchanged. No reason to correct or clarify is the word that goes over here. So I wrote to her, hi, Tracy. Thanks for getting back to me. Did the editors give a reason for refusing to issue corrections for the 18 articles whose main premise, closing plants increases horse abuse, proved exactly the opposite to be true when Ms. Clausing's dates and data were corrected? This seems to me a rather open and shut case. It's not like there's any question her dates, data, and conclusions were in error, something which even the Christian Science Monitor acknowledged with his own correction. And I'll note that the AP is no longer making these false claims. And she wrote back, Vickery, as we've discussed on numerous occasions, the AP has reviewed your criticism and found no reason to correct or clarify our reporting. We have shared your feedback with relevant reporters and editors, and it has helped shape our coverage, and we appreciate your passion and dedication to getting the story right. But I wasn't writing to them because I was passionate. I was writing to them because their facts were wrong. No reason to correct or clarify. So the AP does correct stories, but only if they don't have a political impact. Check this out. Between December 2013 and March 2014, they corrected published versions of stories that misspelled the name of a shooting victim's sister by one letter, misstated a government title, misstated the percentage of ice coverage in 1994 on the Great Lakes as being 94%, when it was really 90.7. That's really going to affect people's lives. Misreported the production status of a movie, stated that a U.S. representative was from Indiana when he represented Pennsylvania, misreported the date of an execution by a month, misstated the number of people killed in a 1976 tsunami. So they do correct dates and they do correct data, but not when they actually bring this country closer to having slaughter plants in it than at any time in the last 7 years. How about that? They corrected one of their stories on Valley Meat, and that's because it misrepresented the views of the National Congress of American Indians. In a July 31st story about horse slaughter, the Associated Press reported erroneously that the National Congress of American Indians was lobbying in support of Valley Meat Company. The organization has been advocating for a return to domestic slaughter, but was not lobbying for the company. So, the lesson is, if you want the press to correct something, you have to threaten them with a lawsuit. People can do that. People who represent the interests of animals could, I suppose, but it's a lot of money to do that. So, threatened with libel, they respond. But threatened with opening slaughter plants, Oh, well, okay, so they did, I think I mentioned earlier, they fixed the error without mentioning it. This, of course, goes against their news principles and values. So I noticed in January, they wrote an article, the last domestic horse slaughterhouses closed in 2007. Yay. A year after Congress initially withheld inspection funding, after federal money was restored in 2011, plants in New Mexico, Missouri, and Iowa began trying to start horse slaughtering. So, I think this is all very instructive and something that is worthwhile all of you knowing. Okay, well, this is kind of interesting. A year ago, the Associated Press admitted that they deserved a public shellacking for misreporting in the Boston Marathon story. And one of their executive editors said, "Our one source rule is very firm in our guidance. We all know why this is important. The world only occasionally remembers when AP held the line and didn't report something that turned out to be wrong. Our mistakes, however, live on and on and on." Tom Kent, the AP's deputy managing editor for Sanders, who's the guy that wrote back to me, highlighted some positive aspects of coverage in an accompanying memo, but noted there were also cases where we violated our principle for one source stories. Well, what did they do in all those stories on Valley Meat? Pretty much one source, Valley Meat employees. So they were willing to admit that they deserved a public shellacking, and there was an entire article on it in the Huffington Post. Last week, it's like 3 or 4 days ago, I submitted my article on why they deserved a public shellacking for misreporting on Valley Meat, but they have not published it. So, this is a spreadsheet. There is I want to publicly thank Nancy Lee, who is a wonderful researcher, and Nancy Lee did a study for me, research for me on how many different news organizations picked up that erroneous language in their reporting. So here's just one page. I mean, she was very detailed. She got the outlet, the reporter, the dateline, the specific phrase, and how they used it. 19, this just represents 19 of 89 major outlets. That's a lot. And I started reaching out to them. I contacted Fox News, NBC News, CBS, Yahoo News. I found the organizations that had misreported the most number of times, and I either used their corrections lines or I sent them letters. None of them responded. And in fact, I think what's important for all of you to know is that you have to push back on these places. You have to do it even if you get this response. But some of them make it so difficult. It took me In some cases, I couldn't even find a corrections line. For major news organizations, I could not find a corrections line. That's really serious. You know, I mean, I put a year's worth of effort into this to get nothing. Imagine if you're just some average citizen who notices something wrong and you want to speak up because you live in a democracy. You can't do that if the press is not responsive and doesn't live up to its news values and principles. I did get a few corrections. There was, as I mentioned, the AP's sneakily changing its dates, and you know what? I'm grateful that they did that. I don't think they like being pushed around by anyone, really. And I know, by the way, I'm not the only person who reached out to them. I know many of you people probably did, and you know, obviously they didn't respond to anyone. But let's see. The Christian Science Monitor, I pursued them for a couple of months. I went through their corrections line. I went to different editors. I got bounced around. And I was thinking, what do I need to do to get something like all I want them to do is recognize that they got a date wrong. It's like, how easy is that? But if they'd recognized that they got the date wrong, the central premise in 18 of their articles would have fallen apart. Well, in any event, the Christian Science Monitor said, you know, Vickery, our editors have told you, you know, back off. And I said, nobody's told me that. And I went back and I said, fine, you know, if you're going to be like this, I'll just write an article on it and I'll send it to your editors. I'm sure they'll like to read it. And then they wrote back. I discussed this story with Marshall Ingerson, the managing editor and soon-to-be editor, and he agreed to make, you know, sorry, this is very hard to read. He agreed to make minor corrections in the AP story. And here, I thought this was very significant. Thanks for your interest and persistence. I got thanked for my persistence. But that doesn't really mean anything because the information was still out there influencing lawmakers. This was a great article that James McWilliams wrote in the Pacific Standard about the AP situation, and of course they said they weren't changing their story. The LA Times, you know, did not respond. So I think I'm not sure if I could call this campaign that I went on a success, other than I really learned how the news media operates. And that's what I want to share with you, so that collectively you can do things to push back and get some results. So how do you end the debate? I have a friend who's very good at Photoshop. I did not do that. And you know, the key word here that's important is debate, because animal stories are set up to be a debate. And because journalists, so many of them, don't have real interest or knowledge of the topic, they get assigned these stories. It's easier for them to say, I'm going to call Wayne Pacelli, and I'm going to call Rick De Los Santos, and just have them talk at each other, and that absolves anyone of having to do any research, which I could tell you, it takes a lot of time. So, here's one thing that I think is worth knowing. Capitalize on events. That story I just did on Clive and Bundy took off, on the grazing program, took off because of Clive and Bundy. It was very topical. And so it's worthwhile you knowing, when you're putting out a press release, tie it into something big for the media that they can hook it onto, because they'll get interest from their audiences in that topic, but they'll also get interest from people who are interested in Clive and Bundy. And you know, I thought what was kind of interesting. So here we've got this is a story the ASPCA did about horse slaughter being blocked by federal law, and here's the press release that went along with that. And then here's something on their website. Of course, Wayne Pacelli had something on his blog and also had this press release that goes out. And of course, what the press release says is, the HSUS also thanks, gosh, I can't even read this, it's really blurry.
Instagram and
Yeah.
And,
but not you.
Yeah.
And by the way, they were getting press on horse slaughter as recently as last week in the Times-Union, and some of you may have seen that story, but it was full of disinformation. And I would really like to ask anybody who's here from these large animal welfare groups, when you see wrong information, you have to push back. You guys are the ones with the money. You guys are the ones with the influence. If you feel the biggest, most powerful animal groups that you can't push back on somebody who buys ink by the barrel, nobody else is going to try. Here's a story. PETA did, I think, a great job with their investigation of the racing industry and got a story in the New York Times. And interestingly, the Humane Society also put out a press release saying, Congress now needs to address horse racing. And I was thinking, really, they're allowed to do that? They can kind of take credit for other people's work? And so I talked to people in both organizations, and they said, yeah, we do it all the time. I was like, that doesn't seem right to me. But I'm not a PR person, but anybody who's here from PR, that's what they do, right?
And they tell everyone the budget is over in September. It's done, over, and they got to start from ground zero.
That's right, yeah.
That's totally untrue.
Yeah, and in fact, I was emailed something from a large animal welfare group, and it misstated what shut the slaughter plants. This was yesterday, and I'd already sent them information on this. They said it was Congress defunding in 2007. I wrote back and I said, you guys have got to get this story right because you're telling it wrong. Here's what happened. I mean, it's not that hard to get it right. So capitalize on events. Increase funding. I mean, I know that when you're all out rescuing horses and doing great things, there really is not a lot of money left over for media. But, you know, the thing is, sorry, by the way, I got to take my jacket off. If you don't do it, that wrong story is just going to get out there, as it did with horse slaughter. And as soon as horse slaughter coverage stopped, we started seeing wild horse overpopulation coverage start. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, it started. That's where we're going to have to battle next. And it was true. From that point on, you know, there wasn't really any more reason to report on the horse slaughter plants. And so there was just story after story about how those darn Mustangs are ruining the range. No talk about the population of cattle or anything. So, I mean, you know, look at how much you're spending. $31 million for education and communications, $54 million for advocacy and public policy, $19 million for research and education. PETA's somewhat less. Grassroots campaigns of $9 million, $698,000, or outreach and public education of $8.5 million. And obviously you're not going to come up with that kind of money, but it is, I don't think it's no surprise to anybody why when you look at a news story, it's not equine advocates who should be quoted. It's PETA, it's the Humane Society, it's the ASPCA, which are fine organizations. But they should not own this issue because oftentimes their facts are not right. So, you know, you can get disinformation from both sides. And I think no matter where it comes from, if you see it, write to the person. It doesn't matter who you are. Call them on the phone and be after them until they correct it. Because I think if enough people do that, eventually it will change. It takes a while, but it's worth the effort. And pay attention to imagery. One of the things I noticed as I'm looking at these different stories, I was thinking back to that claim that the love of a maverick. When the news media covers something, they treat animal activists one way, and they treat cowboys, Indians, and friendly Irish carriage drivers as another. These guys are credible. These guys are animal rights extremists or animal rights activists. And even if you're just a horse person, you will be lumped into that category. I think this is very instructive, and it should tell all of you that if you don't get more representation in the media, the public will never realize that the people who want to end horse slaughter really know the horse issue. They're not just out there pushing against it because they want to end all animal ownership. They're actually people with a lot of knowledge, and it's a disservice to the public for them not to know who the people are who are doing this work. If it was up to me and I was staging protests, I would have this line of people protesting horse stuff look like horse owners. I'd have them look like cowboys or Indians or maybe little girls in jodhpurs with pigtails, jockeys, people in cowboy hats, cowboy boots, dressage riders, so that they know that people who are standing against this are against it because they know horses. And I don't think that the public is really aware of that. So image is important. These are a few tactics to counter media bias. For any organization, make sure you have an expert, relatable spokesperson who responds immediately to media inquiries, because it took me a couple of weeks to pull the information together for that wild horse article that ended my Forbes run. And I was very grateful to get really good help from a lot of people, but it was a lot of information. It was kind of overwhelming. If there's any way that you can get a single person or a couple of people to get all the information and condense it and put a storyline together. Somebody who can frame or simplify or condense info into a tight storyline and also handle corrections. Put out a message that's simple but not too narrow. I think the reason why the slaughter story and the abuse, slaughter plants will improve, horse welfare, or there's too many Mustangs. I think the media went for that because it was so simple. It didn't require a lot of thought. So I think the horse slaughter story and the wild horses story is very complicated. And I think I myself have gone overboard in trying to give people too many facts. And I think shorter stories are better. Shorter, simpler stories. So if you can simplify a storyline for somebody and just hand them all that information on a platter, that will go a long way. Here's another thing that I think really would have helped the wild horse story, and that is infographics. The media loves infographics. And one of the things that really frustrated me was that the whole how many horses versus how many cattle was never graphically depicted in a way that people could say, oh, I get it. Many more, too many cattle, very few horses. And it's not hard to do one of those infographics, but I think it's worthwhile putting one together with some facts on it, just real simple, and getting it into the hands of as many media people as possible, because then they have a better chance of reporting on it. Another thing is good quality photography and online video to support your storyline. When you're going out and working on a story, you got to get stuff really, really fast. So if you guys could, have at the ready, and you probably do, maybe I'm repeating stuff you already know, just have at the ready photography that you can say, here, use this is the caption, because most of the reporters are they're trying to write their story and get it out the same day. So if you don't call them back till the next day, they're probably not going to include anything that you have, any of the information that you want to provide them. So they really need to be responded to immediately. Go beyond Facebook with social media, Twitter. I know a lot of people don't really want to get into Twitter, but Twitter is outward-facing, Facebook is inward-facing. And by the way, I'm asking all of you here, all of you, go to my article on Forbes.com and follow me. If this kind of coverage is important to you, you can show Forbes editors by following me or leaving a comment on the article. If you love it, say so. They need to know. I might not ever get another article on that platform, but somebody else could. You could become a contributor or write op-eds. A lot of, the way that I got some articles published in the Huffington Post was I called their news line. I said, I have a tip. And they said, okay, why don't you write the story? So I did. Anybody can do that. One of the things I always have wanted out of these gatherings is to have some an after party, not just getting together and drinking, but a little bit of that. to have a group of people who meet weekly or bi-monthly on a conference line to discuss what's important, what's going on, what can we do, and not just leave the conversation when you walk out the door. Obviously, a lot has been done at this conference here by people working together, but you can still work together on a conference line. You can get them for free, and I think they're worth having. So I'm going to just tell you what projects, this says projects needing support. So these are the projects that I'm working on. I'm going to continue writing about wild horses, regardless of where or when I'm going to do it. And I found something in my cabinet, which I looked at and I was like, what's this? Well, it's like one of my first trophies. It's very tarnished, and it says NSHA for Nassau Suffolk Horsemen's Association. And the year, 1971, the year the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, I probably got is it Wild Free Roaming or Free Roaming and Wild? Whatever, it was signed in 1971. And I remember writing a letter in support of that. 1971. And here we are still discussing this, and I'm going to keep going at it. The second thing is, and do the same thing. Wherever I show up, become a follower, leave comments. The second thing probably none of you have heard about is that I wrote a script on Dallas Crown. I spent a year, probably more than a year, researching this. I spent time in Kaufman, Texas. I did a 95-page timeline about Paula's story, about all the intersecting legislation. And I produced a pilot script, 60 pages, outline for a first season. And it is now being shopped at HBO, at A&E, and has been sent to Robert Redford. So, if any of you know any other directors or producers or TV, come talk to me, because I'll get it to them. It's gotten good response so far, and how can you go wrong when the first scene is a woman turns on the bath water and blood comes up through the drain. The third thing I'm working on is a website to aid media's coverage of animal issues, and I have a screenshot of an initial design I did on that. And then the last is I'm researching and creating standards for animal journalism because they really don't exist. You have science journalism standards, you have political journalism. I think reporting on this issue is like political reporting, which is kind of like anything goes. And I did propose a panel to NYU's animal ethics program and their journalism school, a panel to discuss how to cover properly animal stories, and so that they're not always he said, she said, and you guys make up your mind who's telling the truth. So, so those are the four things I've been working on, and okay, this is not exactly what it's going to look like, but okay, it's called The Daily Varmint, and basically it is going to review and rate and edit animal stories. And so, for example, on the front page of the Daily Varmint, you would have a story on all the missing horses, what happened to the wild horses Tom Davis bought from the government, which was a great story on ProPublica. And so that gets 4 dolphins. But this one from the Associated Press gets 4 sharks. And so basically what it's going to do is it's going to review them like a book review. And we're going to redline them, we're going to edit them, and we're going to, at some point, invite national experts on a range of animal issues to contribute to this effort so that the media will stop misinforming the public. And I don't want to say getting away with it, because I don't think they think they're misinforming the public. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just, well, this is the way we do it. Well, there's no reason for that. And so the Daily Varmint is going to then reach back to these reporters and say, okay, this is what you got wrong. You want an expert? You don't always have to talk to the big groups. And again, I am not dissing the big groups, but they are oftentimes not experts in some very, some of the smaller animal welfare issues that some of you here may write about or research or care about. So when that is ready, you will certainly know about it. And it's also going to have original content written by experts. And one of the things that's going to help journalists do is connect to experts, because I think it's really hard. If you want to write something like on what Victoria was talking about, these labs in Florida and the monkey situation, who do you reach out to? Do you go to PETA? Well, you could, but maybe you want to talk to a primate specialist or a primate specialist from Mauritius. I'm sure they exist. So this is going to be a way from the media to make it easier on them to report accurately on stuff they don't necessarily know. So I'm excited about that, and that's that. So thank you, and you can follow me on Twitter, and thank you for reading my stuff.